下一讲的话还是关于那个 persistent memory 这一块的这个性能分析相关的啊。Suda 的话是来自于我们 Intel 这边，他在 persistent memory 这一块做性能的这个分析啊，以及这个 monitoring，有非常这个深厚的经验啊，所以欢迎Suda 来给我们做一些这个跟 persistent memory 相关的怎么去用这个 persistent memory，以及怎么去用这个各种方法吧，一些 tuning 的这种methodology来用好这个 persistent memory 啊。那么在他讲的过程当中的话，有任何问题，随时的打断我们，这样的话我们可以及时的做一些交流。因为苏大的话，他比较喜欢那种互相交互式的这种交流啊。那么
Thank you. Hi everybody, my name is Sudha Tyagarajan. I'm a senior performance monitoring engineer at Intel, and my focus at Intel is basically being validation of all of the perf-mon events, that's the events in the PMU, performance monitoring unit, and making sure that they work before they go into all the tools that like Vtune, VPP, all of the other tools that you've been listening to. And I do validation for server and HPC products, but for the past 2 years I've been focused extensively on performance validation of events in the for persistent Intel Optane DC persistent memory for Cascade Lake server. So this topic, I just want to explain a little bit about this. When I say where are the gotchas hidden, I mean what hardware features you need to be aware of to get really good performance out of your application. That's what I mean by where are your gotchas hidden. And also that will give you an idea of which mode, like which persistent memory mode you want to optimize your application for. So the agenda for today is I'm going to give you an introduction. I just did that. There's going to be 3 parts to this presentation. I'm going to give you an architectural background of Intel Optane DC persistent memory and server products. And part 2 is going to be some performance characteristics which will give you some performance numbers that you can apply to your application as well. And also some tips on monitoring and tuning and what tools you need to use to monitor your application. So there are 2 parts of my presentation. You have seen in the paper that there's part 1 and part 2. So for the part 1, I'm going to cover the architectural background. And for part 2 and 3 will be in the second part of my presentation. And of course, there's this page on summary and resources as well. Okay, so this is the focus of the presentation right here. So by a show of hands, how many of you here are software developers or application engineers? Okay, that's good to know. So you're probably aware that you always create a workload or you get a workload from somebody else, right? And then you have to figure out how to tune your application. So you do all of this collection and you analyze the data using various tools. And then you have to find optimization opportunities, and then you tune the workload. And you keep doing this recursively until you tune your workload and you get the best performance. But so what I'm going to be teaching in this presentation is give you a good background on all of the architectural features in Intel Optane DC persistent memory. So when you actually collect your data using our various tools that we offer you, you will know what architectural conditions you need to be looking for and why you need to be looking for those conditions. And then based off that, you can optimize your application and you can utilize the hardware appropriately and efficiently. So you can keep doing this until you tune your workload and get the best performance. What I won't be addressing here is how do I use the SPDK or PMDK? How do I use the Intel Analyzer tools to collect the data? We've got a demo coming up today actually, right? Yeah, today after around 3 p.m. and Jackson is going to be driving that demo and he will talk about how to use the Analyzer tools. And then, what are better design patterns. I'm not going to go over all that. I'm going to give you a good detailed background on the architectural features. So this is the part 1. So the next few set of slides I'm going to be going over a few bunch of terms, architectural terms, some flows, and these are going to be your read and write flows, which are typically seen in an application. You have lots of read and writes going on in an application, so you want to know what actually happens in the hardware, and all of the relevant architectural diagrams that will help you understand how to optimize your application. And why do we need this really? So if you establish a good background in the architecture, you will know what to look for when you're optimizing your application, right? I was an AE for many years, and that's what I needed before I could optimize my application. And based off the architectural knowledge, I'm going to give you, which is going to be in the tail end of the presentation, talk about how to monitor using the tools and also how to tune them and give some suggestions on those for you. Okay, so you've probably heard this in a couple of presentations already, but to give you a background, so we have two more popular interlocked-in EC memory modes. One is the application direct mode, and the other is the memory mode. So the application direct mode, it provides you persistent, but you can also use it in a volatile state for applications. So if you look at this picture here, your application will see DRAM memory, and it can also access app direct memory, but they are two separate memory regions. And persistent memory here, which is app direct as I'm calling it, is byte addressable as well. And when your application can access the persistent memory similar to DRAM using loads and stores. And you also have persistent memory libraries like PMDK library, you have the other library available. So you can use those as well for your application to access this app direct memory. And as I said, they are separate regions, right? So your application cannot talk to if you have data allocated in app direct, it cannot talk directly to DRAM, it has to go through the core and come back. That's something that you need to remember. So what is memory mode? Now memory mode gives what happens, so here is the persistent memory acts as an additional tier of memory between the disk and the DRAM, which is now a cache here. And this basically means that your memory has extended. It's not just DRAM memory, now you have a larger memory available. And here what happens is DRAM memory is a direct mapped cache for persistent memory, and it is transparent to application developers. So it's like similar to what you've been doing, and it's very easy to port. So when you have applications which are already running on server products and you just want to use persistent memory, this is kind of the first thing that people do. Because there's nothing you have to do in your code, you directly port it. And so that's why I say it's transparent to application developers. And like I said before, this is a additional tier of memory. And this memory, what you have to remember, it's not persistent, it's volatile memory. So that is something that you need to be aware of as well. Okay, so this is another very important concept that you need to be aware of. So look, this picture right here, what I'm trying to show here is, you have your DRAM DIMM and you have persistent memory DIMM on the same channel, right? So what that implies is, your hardware resources are going to be shared between these two channels. So your bandwidth is going to be limited by this. So if you have data going to DRAM and persistent memory, you're going to be sharing the bandwidth there. That's something that you need to remember. So in our second generation Intel Xeon processor, we have, you can have 6 Intel persistent memory module socket. And what that means is that you can have 3 modules per memory controller, and there are 2 memory controllers per socket for this processor. And like I said, the DRAM DIMMs share the same bus with the persistent memory DIMMs here. So does anybody have any questions? I like it to be interactive. So we also have Yong here who can help with the translation for me. So if there are any questions regarding the architecture so far, please let me know. You're all good? Okay. Okay, now the next concept is the microcontroller inside the DIMM. How many of you are aware of this microcontroller? Okay, we have a couple of people aware, so this is good then. I've got the right content here. So so now let's look at this. This is a very important microcontroller concept for optimizing your application. This is the media right here, and within the media we have a microcontroller, right? So the microcontroller has a lot of logic in there, and one thing that they also have is a buffer. They have some buffers here, read and write buffers, right? So what that means is when the core requests for 64 byte of data, it goes to the microcontroller. The microcontroller requests for that data from the media. But the media gives 256 byte buffers, 256 byte data back, and it is cached in this buffer here. So when you have the next sequential 64 byte of data, it is actually going to be hitting in this buffer here. So you're going to get some performance advantage out of it. But if you do random access, every 64 byte random access is going to incur a 256 byte transfer from the media to the microcontroller. So that's going to be a longer latency access. So you want to have sequential accesses, and then that's when you can take advantage of this buffer here. So I like to stop here because I usually get questions. So, any questions? Yes?
If there's a lot of process or threads, even if the data from the single thread is sequential access bigger than 256 bytes, if there's a lot of core threads processes
Right.
processing at the same time,
Yeah.
it's going to look like a random 64 bytes.
Absolutely. So this buffer is quite small in size. So if you have many threads, you are going to have the same problem here, because you're going to keep evicting out data out of this buffer and getting new data every time. So we have tools which can help you identify those cases, and you can maybe play around to see if you can reduce the number of threads and get better performance. What this means is that maybe running all 96 threads or 48 threads on your processor is not going to give you the best performance, right? So this is something that people need to look for, which is exactly why I'm showing this to you. Any other question?
What is a DQ buffer in the middle of the Vtune?
DQ buffer?
Yeah. My next.
Oh, these are just buffers in the core. They are core buffers. Yeah, so basically requests go there, and then the request from the core transfers to the uncore, and then it goes to the memory controller, and then from the memory controller it comes to this microcontroller. That's what the DQ buffer is. Okay. Okay, so like I said earlier, the next few sets of slides are actually going to be some important architectural concepts. And these right here that I'm pointing to are important. The reason why I'm going to talk about this is because we have a lot of performance monitoring events in these uncore units, which actually help you to characterize your application. So let's start with the CHA. So everybody is familiar with the core. The core has L1 cache and L2 cache. So we have the CHA, which we call, actually you can call it CHA or the CHA. So CHA is what we call a caching home agent. So the CHA homes the L3 cache and also a snoop filter. So what the CHA does is it manages the L3 cache and also maintains coherency across the sockets. And this CHA's duty is also to track and direct the memory operations such that it goes to the right memory controller if it has to go to the remote sockets memory controller. And the next one is the UPI. So the UPI is what we call the Ultra Path Interconnect. It was called QPI before, now we're calling it UPI. And this UPI unit is responsible for sending transactions across the sockets, right? And now we have the memory controller. So the memory controller, we have 3 memory channels in the second generation Xeon processor. And then within these 3 channels, we have 2 DIMMs that can be populated. And this memory channel has queues. It has reads and write queues, and it has reads and writes queues for DRAM and read and write queues for persistent memory. And it sends those requests to either DRAM or persistent memory. It knows that information. It can do it. And so we have events in there as well, which will help you identify how many requests are going to persistent memory versus how many requests are going to DRAM. Right? So that's what all this is. And this is a very simplified diagram. It's much more complicated than this, but this is a very high level abstract diagram of what it is in the logic, right? So moving on. Okay, so first I'm going to talk about what a basic memory transaction to DRAM looks like. So a request comes from the core. It first checks the L1 cache, and then it doesn't find it there, so that's a miss. And then it goes to the L2 cache. It misses in the L2 cache. At this point, the request is, the term that we use is going off the core. And it goes to the L3. Now the cha. Now the cha checks the L3 cache and the snoop filters. And then based off that, and it's going to be a miss in the L3 cache. And even if it is a miss in the L3 cache, the request is going to be sent to the memory controller. And the cha knows which memory channel it has to send it to as well. Right? And then if it appropriately goes to the DIMM, and the data is retrieved and sent all the way back to the core. Clear so far? Right? Okay, now let's see what happens when you introduce a persistent memory DIMM in here. So this is the entire flow. So when we introduce a persistent memory DIMM in here, so we have a, let's say we have a system with a DRAM DIMM and persistent memory DIMM, right? Similarly, the core sends a request, misses in the L1, misses in the L2, then it goes to the cha, and the cha checks the L3. If it misses in the L3 and the snoop filters, it sends it to the memory controller. Now the memory controller, it goes to the right queue. Like if there is a persistent Intel Optane persistent memory queue in there, so it sends the read request to that queue, and then it sends the data to the persistent memory, and the data is retrieved back. So this is clear, right? So these are all the flows. So, but there's one important concept that I want to talk to you about. Is called the directory. So the directory is a structure which is stored in the. I'm sorry. Did I do something?
No, it's probably the cable.
Sorry. So the directory is a structure which is stored in the memory, right here in the memory. And so every 64-byte line, it has some directory bits as well. And these directory bits will tell if your line, that the requesting line, is cached in another socket's cache or not. And the char here is used to identify that condition, right? So the char looks up the directory and determines whether it needs to snoop across to the other sockets or not. And if the line is not remotely cached in another socket, then you're not going to have a long latency snoop, which is good for you, right? But one thing you need to remember here is the char also maintains directory by updating the memory. And what that implies is these updates to memory are actually going to be writes to Intel Optane DC persistent memory. So that is going to add to your memory bandwidth. So if you have a lot of remote transactions happening and you're not NUMA aware, your application is not NUMA aware, you're going to incur a lot of additional memory bandwidth due to these directories. So you don't want that. So you need to optimize your application accordingly. And we also have events here which identifies whether you have a lot of directory lookups or directory updates happening. Performance monitoring events. Any questions here?
So I saw some performance degradation on accessing remote memory.
Mm-hmm.
Is this the reason?
It could be. This is something that I recommend everybody look for. And we also have some BIOS options that you can play with, and that could help disable the directory or give you some other optimization opportunities. Yeah.
就上面的前面那一页我看到它 Xsocket 是有好多个 L3 cache。对。
Which one?
按照我原来的理解的话，就是 Xsocket 是不是只有
It means here why for one socket there are lots of L3 cache.
Mhm.
So L3 cache.
Yeah.
Yeah. So his understanding is there is only one L3 cache for each socket.
So yes, that's true. There's only one L3. It's a unified cache for each socket. So I've just divided it up like this. So, but if you see, I've just have one among char 0 and char n. There's just one. What am I doing? Sorry. Yeah, among char 0 and char n, there's only one L3 cache here. So it's a unified cache. So there's a hashing function, and the hashing function basically helps the char has that logic in there, and it knows which part of L3 it has to go to get the data. Does that answer your question?
L3是只有一个，但是其实对每一个 core 的话，它有自己的接近它自己核的一部分。
那这个 char 是每个 core 是有
Char is every CPU core has a char.
Yes. So if you have 14 CPU cores, you're going to have 14 chars.
这地方 L3的话，其实它是有一个，它只是简化了。它每个 core 的话会有一个 hash function 去访那个 L3。
Any other questions on this slide? Yes.
就是那个，就刚才说那个 read write 那个 Q，它那是 read write Q 是单独的，比如说我 read Q， write Q， 还是说如果说我现在的 read 特别多，它其实是共快调整的。
So in previous slides you have a read write queue. So is it 2 queue or just one queue for read or write?
They're separate queues.
So have one queue for read and one queue for write.
Yes.
这是两个不同的 queue， 有 read 和 write 两个分开的。
那因为一个看一下不是就可能会有两个 beam， 那我如果两个 beam 这个讨论的时候，它是共享这一个 read 或者一个 write 的 Q， 它两个之间会有什么什么那个优先级吗？比如说。
So in each char there may have two DIMM, right?
Each channel. Yes. Each channel can have two DIMMs.
So that queue is shared or
Yes, it's
separate?
shared. It's shared amount. So each. Okay, let me go back to that slide. It's a good question. Okay, let's look at this one here. This is cleaner. So in this channel, there are going to be 4 queues. So one read and write queue for DRAM and one read and write queue for persistent memory. So there are going to be that many queues for each channel. Yeah. And we have perf-mod events for per channel itself, so you'll be able to see how the transactions are being, how many reads and writes are going to each channel. So you'll be able to identify that as well with your application.
Will populating those the directories count as kernel time or application time?
Application time.
Okay. I see a lot of kernel time when I start heavy reads.
You start having a lot of reads?
Yeah.
Okay. We can
I was
look into
wondering
that.
if so.
Yeah, but it's application time because it's actually a part of your application process, right? Because the directory updates and lookups are a part of the process.
Okay.
Yeah. And that'll be interesting to look at.
Yeah, because for the first 10, 15 seconds, it's half kernel time, half application time, and then it just goes to complete application time. And if I
Yeah,
kill
but the first 10-15 seconds, I don't think it applies to these directories.
Okay, I'm reading almost all the data I've got in persistent memory.
So how it works is if you are doing a local read, right? The directory lookup is combined with your read to the memory.
Yeah.
So you will not see extra reads because of the directory lookup. Does that make sense? But only if you're having a lot of remote socket accesses.
I am doing that because
Oh, you're doing
I'm
that.
not NUMA yet.
Okay. Yeah, then that probably is like
Okay.
some of it. Yeah. Okay. I'll move forward. Feel free to stop me anytime. So the key takeaways of the app direct mode is that the performance is going to vary per workload. It's based on what your workload is doing, right? And so an app direct memory is primarily used for persistence, but you can also use it for volatile reasons, right? If what you need from your application is large amount of memory, not exactly persistence. And I've seen that a lot in the HPC applications. They just want larger memory, and they don't really care for the persistence. So you can use that for that as well. So it has a lower latency access time than accessing to disk. It's going to be higher latency than accesses to DRAM, but lower latency than accesses to disk. So this is a nice in between if that's what you're looking for. And it helps enable larger memory data structures. So the recommendation is that you want to move your in-memory data structures from the disk to your app direct memory. And even in that, you want to move your hot, like that's when we say hot, what we mean here is that frequently accessed data, right? So those data structures can be moved to DRAM because it has lower latency of accesses, right? Access time is much lower here. And your warm data structures to the persistent, interrupting DC persistent memory. And you need to optimize for NUMA awareness because you are going to incur a lot of memory bandwidth. It's going to add to your memory bandwidth if you have a lot of directory lookups and writes, updates. Okay, so now I'm moving to the memory mode section of this talk. So this, here I'm again showing you a picture of where we have obtained DC persistent memory as an additional tier of memory between the DRAM cache and the disk, right? So this DRAM cache over here is what we call as a direct mapped cache. So what that means, now going back to your architectural basics here. So what that means is that multiple lines of your interrupting DC persistent memory can map to the same cache line. That's what a direct map cache is. So this is something you need to keep in mind when you're optimizing your application for interrupting DC persistent memory in this memory mode configuration. So suppose you have, say, a 1:8. So you have 32 GB of DRAM and 256 GB of interrupting DC persistent memory. What that means is that 8 lines of interrupting DC persistent memory can map to the same line in the DRAM cache. So you can get a lot of conflict misses, and you should be looking for that, right? And what is the stag here? So the stag is again additional bits in the cache line, which helps the memory controller identify if the line you're requesting for hit in the DRAM cache or not. That's what the stag is. Yeah, I think I covered it all. So moving forward. So now what does a read transaction look like in a memory mode and when you hit in the DRAM cache, right? So again, the request is sent from the core to the L1 cache, misses in the L2 cache, the request is sent to the char checks the L3 and Snoop filters, and at this point it is sending it to the memory controller. So the memory controller, first thing it does is it sends it to the DRAM. The request is sent to the DRAM cache and to fetch the requesting line. So and at this point there's a tag check, and it identifies that there is a near memory hit. That means the requesting line hit in the DRAM cache based off the tag check which I showed you in the previous slide, right? And then now the request is sent back to the core. So what this means is that if you hit in your DRAM cache, your latency is going to be your DRAM latency. Okay? So now this is what it is. Yeah, and we also have events in the memory controller called tag events, which will help you identify if you hit in your DRAM cache or not. So these are the perf events, and they are in the memory controller, and we also have them in mesh to mem. But anyways. So now what happens if you have a DRAM cache miss, right? I'm going to skip this because it's misses L1 cache, L2 cache, sends it to char, misses in the L3 cache. Now the request goes to the memory controller. Now from the memory controller, the request sends it to the DRAM. The data is retrieved, and here the memory controller determines and identifies that this is not the line that the core is requesting. So the request is again sent back to the interrupting DC persistent memory, and the data is retrieved and sent back to the core. So the key takeaway here is, if you miss in the DRAM cache, that means your latency is going to be the DRAM latency plus your Intel Optane DC persistent memory latency. So you want to optimize your application to make sure that you have more hits in your DRAM cache. So the question here is, when we have a miss to DRAM, when will the data be written from the persistent memory to DRAM, and when is the data sent to the core? DRAM. So it happens simultaneously. So the way it works is, let me go back to this. So when the request is sending it to the memory controller, once again, right now I'm just showing you how it's sent back to the core, right? So there's also a step involved here which happens in parallel. Yeah, in parallel, where the write is the missed data is written back to the DRAM cache as well.
So produce like a memory controller to send the data back to the core.
Yes.
And at the same time you send data.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can you configure it so specific addresses or ranges will not be written back to DRAM? Maybe it's a one-time read I'm doing from the persistent memory. I don't want to write over what's cached.
No. I think the way it works is it has to be written back to. Yeah, there is. Yeah, it has to be written back. There is this concept of non-inclusive, but that's between the DRAM and the LLC, L3. But this is going to be always written back. If there is a read, if there's a non-temporal write, you don't have all that, right? It just directly writes. If it's a write, it directly writes. But if it's a read, it's always going to be cached in the DRAM.
You have two different data sets, and one is very hot, and the other
Yeah.
is just once in a while. You don't want to
Yeah.
to contaminate.
Right. But no, you'll always end up having something evicted out. Yes. So the non-temporal, the way it works is the core sends the request. It always checks its L1, L2, and L3 caches and makes sure that there are no modified copies of that line, right? And then those modified copies will be evicted and sent to the memory, and then you do a non-temporal write. But one thing you have to remember, that when you're doing a non-temporal write to persistent memory, there's still going to be a read because of the tag check, to make sure that that line is not cached in the DRAM. It's not going to be a direct write to persistent, Intel Optane DC persistent memory. I can talk about it later to you. Yeah, it's quite straightforward. Basically, how it works is, let's see. So here we do a check, right? This check is still going to be there because it has to make sure that it's not in the DRAM cache. So your non-temporals are not like non-temporals to DRAM. It's going to incur a read and then a write. Yes. So we have events in the memory controller called tag events, which can basically, we have tag events which say whether you are hitting in your DRAM cache or missing in your DRAM cache. And then we also have these in our tools. So we have these metrics in both Vtune and platform profile as well. Yeah, and I'm going to talk about that towards the end of the presentation. Mhm. Yes. So there are events in each of the channels. So you have that logic in each of the channels. So it'll identify that. Oh, you mean are they going to be across like, yeah, the memory controller identifies all of that. Yeah, the events are there. So you can get all of our events from oven.org. That's where we have all of our events. So in case you want to know what all of that is, let me know. Yeah. But we have this in our tools as well. So. They are all on code events. So you cannot tie them back to lines of code. These are all in the memory controller, right? So they are called on code events. They are not core events. Okay, so the key takeaways of memory mode. What that means, so here it is that if you have good locality, you're going to get near DRAM performance. If it's a cache hit, then your latency is going to be same as DRAM. And if it's a cache miss, that means your latency is going to be the latency of DRAM plus your latency of accesses to inter-opting DC persistent memory. So the performance again is going to vary by workload. The best workloads that we've seen have these following traits. They have good locality, they have low memory bandwidth demand, and your number of reads are higher than your number of writes, are greater than the number of writes. And that's because reads have are more performing than writes. That's one of the reasons. And when you want to look into the memory mode, you need to take into consideration what's the configuration versus what's the workload size. So if your workload size is so big that it has to get the data from the disk, or it's constantly missing your DRAM cache, then that's not a good workload, right? And so you might want to modify your configuration accordingly. And when I say modify your configuration, is look into how many DRAM DIMMs you have, what sizes of the DRAM DIMMs are, versus how many persistent interlopting DC persistent DIMMs you have, right? And the sizes. And here as well, you are going to run into the same directory concept here, so you need to optimize for new malwareness. So I'm going to stop here. We are at 10:30. So I'll take a few questions if anybody has. And then we have another session, part 2 of the session, and we can start that in 10 minutes.
是往下印那个 int 的那个文案，然后我要到发那个 memory 里面去，然后我这边读完这个，我命中了这个发 memory， 然后把它给写回到 memory control 的 buffer 里，然后再返回去。那我是想说问，如果我下次再去命中的时候，再命中，因为如果说它在这个 memory control buffer 里，我就直接返回了嘛。但是就是我是想问，这部分如果说有段时间就是这部分 buffer 被触呢，它会再写回到 DRAM 中吗？还是说它其实就是直接被触掉？就是我是想问说，那它这个就是那个就如何？
你是说那个就是那个 DIMM 里面那个小 buffer 吗？
对对对对，
control 里面。Can you go back to one of the previous slides? So you mentioned there is a buffer, right? Buffer in the DIMM.
Oh, the DIMM.
Yeah,
Okay.
DIMM buffer.
Sorry guys, that's my cat.
所以你的问题是，当那个 buffer 被冲掉以后，是吧？
对，它是对冲掉的时候，它会不会就写在这样子？假如说，我就是想问那个冷热之间是不是，它是说不同的是切换这个DRAM在那个
你是说这个 buffer 吗？是那个？
对对对对对。因为我命中了那个发 memory 之后，然后我是要把它你是先就是读到 memory 的 control 的 buffer 中嘛，然后再给到那个
So yeah, if we read this buffer, right? I read the data from the DIMM, and first the data will go to the buffer.
Yes.
And next time is if this data get evicted, so 你说这个 buffer 是然后出去了对吧？就是被
被冲掉了，那这个冲掉的内容，它会往再写发这部分会再写回到那个。
When this get buffer get evicted out, so the data in this buffer, can this data in this buffer be write out to the memory?
Yes.
它是 write 的那个 near memory 还是 far memory?
There are two memory, right? So the buffer could, the data could get from the near memory or.
No. So this concept is different from DRAM cache, which is what I think the question is, right? Near memory versus far memory.
Yes,
So near memory is DRAM cache, right? And far memory is interlopting DC persistent memory. Okay, so the confusion I think here is how does this buffer apply when you have an eviction from your DRAM cache? Is that correct? Right. So when you're evicting out of the DRAM cache, that line is going to be written back to the far memory, but first it is going to be written back to this buffer, right? This buffer. So there is going to be some logic in here to see whether you hit in this buffer or you miss in this buffer. Think of it as another level, third level here.
他是说这个，因为你这个 data 这个 buffer 你是从那个DIMM 那边过来的吗？
It is in the DIMM.
原来是从那个 file memory 过来的。
你的 file memory 就是那个。
This is the file
persistent
memory. This is the file memory.
然后它被充了之后，它还是
你如果你充了，然后它还是会写出去的呀。
写出去，我是写到那这部分。
就是你的那个 DIMM 里面。对对对。
所以我从 file memory 原来是从 file memory 来的，然后如果我是被充了之后，
你还是写出去。对。
那就是如何冷热切换，就是我只让你跟这个 file memory 就是 memory 跟 file memory 之间的数据怎么是有切换呢？
好像你问的这个问题，它应该是如果你的数据是这是 memory 读上来，刚才解读这个问题，读上来以后 memory controller 里面，然后你不是往上送吗？
对。
往上送的时候，它同时会把那个数据给写到那个 DRAM 里面去。
这时候就写或者
对，它
写到
同时
DRAM
会写的，它不说 in parallel， 同时它会写到那个 DRAM 里面去，所以你下次它会先去查那个 DRAM 里面有这个数据。
所以这时候是先写回的是写回的DRAM，不是
因为读上来它会写到 DRAM 里面去，然后是说它会查你的 DRAM 有没有，如果 DRAM 没有命中，那时候理论上应该有了，
对，
它应该有，如果它没有，
明白。好，谢谢，就是这个。
对 ，OK。
So if you want, I can draw it and show it to you after.
His question is the data goes to the buffer, and actually this data is read into the DRAM already, right? If I read the data, and the data goes to the buffer, and later, simultaneously this data will go to the DRAM.
One of this?
Yeah.
Yeah. It will
Automatically.
be returned back to the user. So you don't have to worry about this part. Then the next part is going to be about. So far, all of you have been probably attended Jackson's talk, you've attended Sergey's talk, and we have Roman's talk coming up. So they're all talking about tools, but here I've kind of consolidated everything into a few set of slides, so it can give you quick references. That's the whole idea here. Kind of like a review, once again, of all of this. So, there you go. Okay. Alright, so these are collected by our power and performance teams at Intel on a system, on a second generation Xeon system, where we have only one Intel Optane DC persistent memory DIMM populated. And these numbers here are collected using our Intel's memory latency checker tool. How many of you are aware of this memory latency checker? Yeah, cool. So it's very useful for getting bandwidth and latency measurements. So the Intel Optane DC persistent memory is programmable, and it has different power limits that you can program for. So these are the watt granularities, and it ranges between 12 watts to 18 watts. And 18 watts is where you're going to get the best performance, right? So these numbers are at 18 watts. The size of the module that we're using is a 256 GB module of Intel Optane DC persistent memory. So this table here, what I'm showing you is that the performance varies based on the traffic pattern, right? So here I've got a granularity of 256 bytes, which is 4 sequential 64-byte accesses, and then we have a random 64-byte accesses here. And I also divided the traffic between reads, writes, 2 read and 1 write as well. So if you have a granularity of 256 byte access, that's how your access patterns are. On a single DIMM at 18 watt, you're going to see a bandwidth of 8.3 GB per second. For a write, that comes down considerably to a 3.0 GB per second. And writes are less performant than reads. That's how it is. And for a 2 read, 1 write, it's at 5.4 GB per second, right? Now, if you look at the random cases here, reads are at 2.13 GB per second. So that's about 1/3, right, of 8.3. And this is because of the the buffer that I was talking about in the microcontroller. So if you, every time you access a new line, 64-byte line, it is going to incur a read, right? It's going to be a miss. And the next subsequent 64-byte lines, next 3 64-byte lines is going to be a hit. And that's why we have a 1/3 ratio here. And for a write, it's 1/3 again. And 2 reads, 1 write, you have 1.35 GB per second. So this is what I was talking about, is like how you can take advantage of the buffer in the microcontroller. Any questions here? Okay, so moving to the next slide here. So this slide basically, it's a very crowded slide, so let me walk you through it. We're doing idle latency accesses here. We have reads, writes, 64-byte reads and writes here. We have 256-byte reads and writes here. As you can see over here, your latency versus bandwidth, right? You're going to get better bandwidth with reads, and with it's also better with reads, writes. But if once it's 64-byte accesses, the bandwidth goes down considerably. And now here, what we're comparing to is an Optane DC SSD and NVMe SSD here. You can see that it's reads and writes, the latency of reads and writes to persistent memory is much lower than it is to the SSDs. That's what I'm showing in this slide here. So it's literally 2x read and write bandwidth versus the disk, and this is only with one module. So you're going to get better bandwidth with more modules in your system. And this is the read idle latency. It ranges from 180 nanoseconds to 340 nanoseconds for reads and writes, versus the DRAM where it's about 70 nanoseconds, 80 nanoseconds. So that's kind of the difference you see here. Any questions here? I'm going to give you a second to kind of take this all in because it's quite a lot of data in here. Mm-hmm. So so from the core, you always do only 64-byte accesses. But if it's continuous and it adds up to 256-byte continuously, that's when you're going to see this performance, right? But if it's going to be random accesses, that's what I mean by 64-byte here. It's going to be very random accesses. That's when you're going to see this performance here. But it's always a 64-byte access from the core. Yes?
So how does this access pattern connect to the actual application memory usage? Like, because application is accessing memory like word size. So what does a sequence access mean in the application code?
So could you repeat that?
So how does this access pattern in the memory connect to the memory access in the application?
So memory access in the application is if you have contiguous lines, right? That's what we're looking for. You need to have contiguous access, and that's the case with most applications. If you have sequential accesses, you're going to get better performance than random accesses. That extends to persistent memory, interrupted DC persistent memory. Okay. So your question is, how do we translate, like how application developers write their code to this?
Yes.
So they basically need to keep in mind that you need to have 64-byte contiguous accesses, irrespective of whether it's 8 bytes or whatever, right? You need to keep into mind that. When you're writing your data structures, you need to keep into mind that. And that's similar how you do it with cache lines also, right? When you're doing L1, L2, L3 caches, that's the same concept because if you're not accessing sequentially, you're going to keep evicting stuff out of the L1, L2, L3 cache. That same process extends here. Yeah.
So an example would be then, if we've got an array of struct,
Yes.
and that
Good
structure
question.
by default is 48 bytes, so we're better off actually padding it to 64
Yes,
bytes.
absolutely. Yes. You need, yeah.
So then you get the 64
Yeah. So if you're doing, then you'll end up with partial line access. And you don't want that either. Yes, that's a good one. Thank you for helping me with that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? No. Okay. Okay, so the part 3, moving on. I'm going to talk about what monitoring and tuning strategies you can apply your application to, right? So the first optimization opportunity is, and I've spoken about this a lot, your read versus your write ratio. So if your workload has a very write-intensive application, you might want to take a look at it, because reads to Intel Optane DC persistent memory are faster than writes. It's just more performant than writes. And you can detect this issue, or we want to call it as an opportunity here, to optimize your application for this case, is using either the Vtune platform profiler, where we have persistent memory traffic read or write throughput metric, and then we have Intel Vtune amplifier persistent memory bound metric under memory access analysis. And this is the one Sergey talked about in his previous presentation. So you can use either of these to detect whether your application is very write intensive, and then based off that you can have some potential optimizations. And our recommendation here is you want to move your write sensitive data to DRAM. It's basically DRAM's writes to DRAM are better than writes to Intel Optane DC persistent memory. And then if the other option here is that if you're not using all of the 6, if you're not populating your socket completely with DIMMs, you might want to consider that. 6 modules per socket it's ideal, and this will in turn give you more bandwidth. So you can consider that as another optimization opportunity here. Okay, the next one, so access pattern. We've spoken about this a lot. So if you want to identify if your workload behavior has random media access or not. There is Intel Vtune platform profiler has this already. It's an error here. It's already available in the public release. So you can download Vtune platform profiler, and there is a way for you to identify if you've got read hits or write hits to that buffer. And that will tell you in turn if you are doing random accesses versus sequential accesses. So you can look into that. This is an error, guys. It's already publicly released. So the potential optimization here is you want to stream data in aligned chunks to 56-byte chunks. And this is another question that I was asked earlier in this on this talk, is that what happens if you stream from too many threads? You might want to consider reducing the number of threads and seeing if you're getting better performance. Because that too many threads means you're going to have a lot of evictions outside this buffer. And this buffer is small. So that's something to look at. The next question is, this is for memory mode. It's cache locality. So the workload behavior is sensitivity to DRAM caches, right? So if your working set size is greater than your DRAM capacity, that's going to result in a lot of conflict misses. And we have tools and we have metrics in tools where you can identify this conflict misses. So we have in Vtune platform profiler under memory mode analysis, we have a near memory cache read miss rate. That will tell you if you're having a lot of misses. And also in Vtune amplifier in memory access, we have DRAM cache hit ratio under memory access analysis. I think this was not talked in any of the previous talks that we have, but this is something that you can look at as well. So the potential optimization is you want to improve your DRAM cache locality. So maybe you want to consider blocking or something else that can improve your DRAM cache locality. And maybe your application is just not suitable for memory mode. If that is the case, you might want to consider, and what you need is you want to extend memory. You want a larger amount of memory. In that case, what you can do is consider using AppDirect volatile memory instead. Maybe that will help you. Because initially, before you were using the disk, And now you might want to use this, and it's going to get you better performance out of the box there. And the ideal DRAM memory capacity to Intel Optane DC persistent memory capacity is 1:4 or 1:8. 1:4 is obviously going to be better than 1:8 because that's going to mean lesser conflict misses. Next one, directory overhead. And I spoke about this directory concept, right? So if your workload has unnecessary cross-socket accesses, that's going to incur a lot of directory updates, and that's going to add to your memory bandwidth. So how can you detect this opportunity is we have a metric in Intel Vtune platform profiler. It's called extra write bandwidth due to directory updates. So if you can see that you have a lot of write bandwidth due to this directory update metrics, you can look into your application and optimize for NUMA. The potential optimizations are optimizing for NUMA. You want to eliminate false sharing across sockets. And the other recommendation here is you want to investigate BIOS settings. In the BIOS, under memory, there are a bunch of other settings that you want to look at to see if you can get rid of the directory, if that's something that's an issue for your application, there is options for that. And there are a few other BIOS settings. So if you're under NDA, you can come to me and I can tell you about the BIOS settings more. So the next optimization opportunity is disk access. So if your application workload behavior, you see a lot of disk I/O, right? So you want to access data in Intel Optane DC persistent memory rather than disk. It's just a lot more performant. And we have Vtune platform profiler. We have a view called IO view, and we have an IOPS metric in there. And Roman is going to talk about this in the next presentation. And we also have, Roman is going to talk about the next one. In Vtune platform amplifier, we have input and output analysis. And within that analysis, there are a bunch of IO metrics that can be used to identify if you're doing a lot of disk IO or not. So the potential optimization here is you want to keep your working data set in your Intel Optane DC persistent memory. So the summary here is Intel Optane DC persistent memory has been architected for performance, persistence, and it's optimized for performance as well. So it offers persistent capabilities. It is near DRAM latency, and it's much faster than SSDs. There's flexibility in operation, and what I mean by that is you can choose between two modes. You have memory mode, which gives you large, affordable, volatile memory, and then you have app direct mode, which can be used for persistence and can also be used for volatile purposes. And then you want to monitor and tune to take advantage of the modes effectively. Like any processor, you're not going to get performance out of the box. You need to monitor, you need to tune your application to utilize all of the hardware resources and and squeeze all the performance you can get out of it, right? So you have to monitor and tune for that. And we have various software tools that are available. Like I mentioned, we have Vtune amplifier, we have VPP, we have PCM, we have a bunch of tools that are available, and you can utilize all of these tools for those purposes. And these are the resources. Download the tools, you can get the training. I just want to mention that I also have a paper on this, a white paper on this. So if your company is under NDA, I have a detailed paper on architecture, like what the architectural flows are, and how you can tune them and etc. So if you're under NDA, just get your Intel contact me and I can send that paper to you. All right, any questions before I wrap up? Okay, so I encourage you guys to attend the demo today. Jackson is going to be giving the demo, and we're all going to be there to support him. And also Roman is going to be talking about I/O in the next session, so you should definitely attend his talk as well. Any questions?
舒导刚才讲了，就是在座各位同事，那个你们公司和 Intel 之间如果签了 NDA 的话，你可以找到你们的 Intel 的那个销售代表account manager 之类的，然后跟我们联系，有一些额外的文档可以发给大家看一下。 啊，你找销售或者是我们的英特的联系人吧，啊，都能找到。Asking them to contact the Intel account manager if they have the NDA. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your time and listening.